Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for joining us. My name is Bo Bruskern. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fintech Nexus. And today's webinar is Fintech's Wake-Up Call, the Hidden Dangers of Dormant Accounts. We have a star-studded panel. Thank you to Telesign for making this possible. With us today, we have Juan Rivera from Telesign. We have Murli Gulueswar from Citi, Nicholas Walzer from Visa, and Perli Wang from Alloy. Great participants. It's going to be a fantastic session. And we've collected a lot of questions from you, the audience, in signing up for this webinar. So we're going to get to those. But I want to remind everyone, to engage. As many of you know, the way that we love to run these sessions is to get audience engagement early and often. So there's a Q&A button on your screen right now that you can use to engage with us and ask your questions. And we will absolutely get to as many of those questions as we can. Let's do some intros. I'm going to hand it off to Juan. And Juan, take it away. Let's hear about a little bit about you and the context that you're coming to this conversation with.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Juan Rivera. I'm a senior solutions engineer at Telesign. So I've been aligned to Telesign for about 3.5 years in both a post-sale and a pre-sale capacity. And a little bit about Telesign. We're a global digital identity and CPaaS organization with some of the largest web properties in the world as our customers. And we primarily focus on preventing fraudulent activities common with account onboarding, maintaining account integrity, and enhancing user experiences for businesses operating in the digital landscape. So that is a little bit about me.
Great. Murli?
Good afternoon, everybody. Murli Gulueswar. I run decision sciences on the consumer side at Citi. Our team mission is to deliver faster, wider, and deeper data-driven insights to achieve superior decisions and material financial outcomes. That mission statement is near and dear to us because it really does sort of position us from thinking of analytics as a function that delivers intelligence to a capability that drives horizontal material outcomes through innovation, as viewed through the lens of a CEO, CFO, and head of audit. Good to be here.
Excellent. Nicholas?
I am Nick Walzer. I'm the global head of risk and identity strategy for Visa. Relatively new joiner to Visa, but I have 28 years of experience in this space across working for banks, in big tech, and then in consulting across fraud, risk, identity topics. So very excited to be here with this distinguished panel.
That's great. And Perli?
Awesome. Hey, everybody. I'm Perli Wang. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Alloy. Alloy is the only end-to-end identity risk management platform for companies offering financial products. We begin with origination and account opening, and then work with banks and fintechs to give them a scalable, flexible platform to manage identity risk throughout the customer lifecycle. So we focus on configurable solutions for fraud, credit, compliance risk, and bring in-house expertise and a very extensive ecosystem of data partners, including Telesign, and help companies deliver great financial products to their customers around the world. I've been with Alloy for about 1.5 years, but have been a leader in product at a variety of fintechs before that. So have been thinking about how to build amazing digital product experiences with all of the risk that underlies those digital product experiences in financial products for most of my career, and excited to be here talking about that today with all the great panelists.
Phenomenal. Like I said, just a great intellectual powerhouse we have here. So Juan, I think let's just kick it off with maybe a softball, but I think is a very relevant question, which is, why are we talking about dormant accounts? You know, of course, discussions about fraud are ripping because fraud itself is ripping, but like dormant accounts, that's kind of a niche topic. So why are we here talking about that?
Yeah, and I'm totally, as long as I get all the softballs, we're good. No, look, dormant accounts, just a step back, right? These are inactive accounts, right? Little to no account activity. And that also refers to customer initiated activity, right? Or contact. These accounts are lucrative. These are attractive targets for identity thieves. And I don't think these are discussed enough. And the reason they're lucrative is because the account holder is not actively monitoring the account. So fraudulent transactions can actually go unnoticed for an extended period. In other words, fraudsters can run rampant on these accounts, and the owner of the account probably wouldn't know about it unless they're notified by the banking institution. So this can lead to some really heavy or steep potential financial losses if they goes unnoticed.
And so from the practitioner's standpoint, what are the rest of you seeing in terms of like when you hear about dormant account exploitation? What does that bring to mind, or like how do you react to that concept?
I can jump in on that one, given some of the consulting work I've done across the financial services industry, and in fintech, also in interesting niches like retirement and wealth and asset management. We saw many cases where we were able to use data signals to identify ways that mule accounts or dormant accounts were being used as mules to be the cash out phase of a fraud attack. And so upstream, there are a lot of different drivers of how the holder of money is convinced to let go of that money, or it's taken from them. But it also has to be then moved out of the financial system and then laundered and cleaned. So these accounts are one of the linchpin ways that fraudsters are able to move dirty money or illicit money, stolen money out of the hands of the true owners and into a place where the regulators and law enforcement can't necessarily claw it back.
Nick, I'm actually curious because you did mention the mule accounts. Now, I know mule accounts to be, by definition, either a willing participant, right? There's somebody that knows the mule in this, or the unwilling participant. It sounds like dormant account falls into the unwilling participant. Have you noticed a shift in trend from fraudsters and the idea that it is maybe more beneficial to move into the unwilling participant territory with dormant accounts?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think there's the willing and unwilling piece of this. One of the big sea changes in this space that we've seen in some of our investigative work over the years is that in some cases, these accounts are set up by fraudsters using stolen identity or synthetic identity, or the fraudster may be able to take over an account that's been dormant for a long time. Now, they may leave that there, quiet, safe looking, not attention grabbing for a long period of time. Some of these may age for years because, just like fine wine, the value of these accounts in the dark market goes up with the age of the account. And so fraudsters are able to sell. Is that true
if they're actually like just dormant? They've just been sitting there for years, no activity. Because don't you notice that I've been sitting on that dormant account for 3 years?
It's a great question. The insight there is that for better or for worse, a lot of the fraud detection that happens across the industry historically treats newer accounts in one way and treats aged accounts in a more trusted way. And the older or the more aged the account, especially if they have some activity way back, the less scrutiny you may put on some reactivation or some new activity.
Sorry to interrupt. Please continue. I've got a great analogy to bring up later, but carry on.
Could I add, if I may, Nick? Sorry, I didn't mean to sort of talk over you. I'll pause to see if you.
No, dive right in.
So I have a slightly different angle to this that I'd like to bring for us to consider, which is, if you think about dormant accounts, there's a downside risk of fraud, or that customer actually being re-engaging that account only when there's a critical need, which means that it brings with it risks of default and things of that nature. I also see the other side of it, which is it's an opportunity to say there was somebody, assuming they were legitimate, wanted to do business with you, and chose, for whatever reason, to stop doing business with you, or to never even initiate that relationship, despite actually perhaps getting a physical card or opening an account or what have you. And for me, the way I would think about it is the other side of the equation of what Juan and you were talking about is there a product fit problem? Is the customer inherently a gamer? Or was there some form of customer experience issue at the onset that actually led them to be disenchanted with your product or with your brand overall? Yep. So the other piece of it in my mind is sort of toggling what is that 360 view of what that consumer or that customer is engaged in? How are we fitting into their landscape of financial services needs, and what opportunities does it create? So for me, it's sort of the yin and yang in some ways, I suppose.
And to a certain extent, Murli, the point you're making ties back to your question, Bo, about like, you know, can't you tell if a dormant, like, can't you just know that it's a dormant account and then treat it as appropriately risky? I think it's really important for us to kind of break down this population, because the segmentation of the population really matters. And I think when you think about the segments, you can see why just cutting off all dormant accounts would be like a very bad thing for you. I think there's a first component of the original identity associated with the creation of the account, right? Maybe it's a legitimate person opening a legitimate account with a legitimate use case. Maybe it is a legitimate person opening a legitimate account with bad intention, right? Whether that's an intent to be a money mule or an intent to commit first-party fraud, or it can be a third-party identity theft or a synthetic identity with the intent to nurture, build that history, and then eventually, commit various nefarious activities on the other side. That is a piece of why, understanding identity at account opening is so critical, because if you didn't get that part right, detangling the dormant accounts downstream is going to be pretty messy and hard to do. On the flip side, there are folks who legitimately open accounts with an intent of some form of set it and forget it, whether that's as a backstop or, Nick, I think you even mentioned some of the other use cases around maybe wealth management or other accounts where it's not intended to be super active. You're not trying to log in every day. And of course, we always have the angle of folks that open an account in person with no intent to transact digitally or interact digitally. We force many of them to open digital accounts that they have no intent of using. And then there's kind of the whole digital identity, even if they're active users of a physical product. All of those kind of can broadly be umbrellaed as dormant accounts. But I think when you start breaking it apart, I'm sure there's other dimensions this great group can come up with as well. But it's when you break it apart that you see that something that just said like, hey, haven't logged in 90 days to your online account, we're cutting you off. Like there are a lot of really good customers that you eliminate with brute force strategies like that. So our take would be, really deeply understand that identity up front, get that right. And then having very tailored ongoing treatment strategies depending on that upfront risk as you start to see dormancy over time.
Apparently, as Visa, we see the transactions, right? We see that flow, and we've got to make very quick decisions around whether we think this transaction is low, medium, or high risk. And we are always hungry for what you're talking about, which is some of those upstream assurances that can be put in place. What's been interesting to us over the recent periods is, as we move toward wallets and as we move toward biometrics and as we move toward device-based trust, tokenization, some of these other initiatives that are intended to squeeze fraud out of the transaction space, all of those create new weak links in the chain upstream that need to be hardened around verifying the identity, to your point, and is this person who they say they are? What are they opening this for a legitimate intent or purpose? But then secondly, as they continue to pop up for some of those additional events, as they download the app for the first time, set up their biometrics, put a card in a wallet, what are we doing to verify that they continue to be who they say they are so that we can trust that device or that token?
Yeah, Nick, are there one-time password weaknesses? Is that a pretty weak multi-factor authentication standard, or is that really a great option? I think that's maybe not such a softball one. Maybe I think you're probably well qualified to answer that one.
No, yeah, and that's an excellent question. I think as a suggestion, you should never be utilizing just a single point of authentication, like a one-time password. In fact, we could have an entire webinar around vulnerabilities around one-time password and the exploitation of how much data is available, such as phone number behavior or phone number insights, email, all of that. We got to keep in mind, we use our email as a repository for so much information, right? And it really is sometimes only backed by username and password and maybe an additional step up, but that's an option that's given to a lot of people. So the exploitation of email is always a high risk. Same with phone numbers. You could say the same, with SIM swap or SIM hijacking, right? Somebody convincing the telcos that you are the owner of the phone number, and suddenly now you're the owner of the phone number. Every one-time password would go to you. So those are definitely vulnerabilities. That's why it's important to include a multi-factor authentication in the step. I think Nick touched on this. Apparently touched on this as well. We're introducing biometrics, right? User-based behavior modeling. All of that is very important as well. And then I think there's something to be said about creating a balance around that, right? Because yes, we want to protect the user in every step of the engagement by introducing by behind the scenes, right? Looking at data points, phone number analytics, email analytics, whatever, and then creating a multi-factor on the front end. But at what point does it become too much, right? Where the user, it may even be a contribution for why the user steps away from the account, whether it's partially created, but now becomes a dormant account. They're like, you know what? There's just way too many conditions for me to create this account. I've gone through the step of maybe uploading or updating my banking information, so it exists there, but I'm never going to use it again. Because the experience was so poor. And now we have a dormant account that was just born. So,
as anybody who's ever tried to log into an account while on a plane can probably attest, it's very easy to not have access to your stuff. And it really is real. To Merle's point earlier, Juan, to your point just now, the more friction you create, the more likelihood you create of ultimate good customer attrition. And so it really is in sort of coupling. What do you know about this identity? With identity, really sitting at the core of how you assess fraud. What do you know about this identity? And then how do you tailor your treatment strategies to the riskiness inherent in that identity? And how do you detect changes in the risk of that identity over time? One thing you see a lot with dormant accounts is elder abuse, for example. And, how do you notice that something funky is happening there where, my grandmother has been a very low risk banking customer her entire life, but if something nefarious happened to her account, I would really hope that would get noticed as being very unlike her at that point in time. Ties back in at both biometrics and behavioral data as critical to pieces of this broad puzzle.
We have an award to give to our first question that's been asked, which is great within the 18-minute mark. Ragaram is asking, potential closure of dormant accounts in financial institutions could also create increased operational efforts around customer support, issuing refunds, etc. How have you managed or planned for such impacts in the past? Great question.
Yeah, I can dive in on that one, at least to get the ball rolling. It certainly isn't a double-edged sword, as we've been discussing here on this call from many angles, and it can create a negative moment of truth for customers, similar to an unrecognized or disputed transaction, or there are a number of negative events that you really have to treat carefully from a CX perspective, and you have to look at the relationship you have with that consumer. In some cases, introducing more security at that point helps that consumer to feel comfortable that you've got their back, you're doing the right things, you're securing this relationship at this important moment. In other cases, it just builds the frustration. And so having different customer handling strategies based on what you're trying to achieve and really giving the user options that are equivalently strong, but different paths that they can take to get what they're trying to achieve is one of the paths to value we've seen in avoiding a lot of drop off in those interactions.
The way I would think about it is, could we quantify the value of the customer experience? So, i.e., how much does the customer value this relationship with this particular institution or product, and how much does the institution / firm value that customer relationship And what is that toggle in terms of having the likelihood of success in actually reactivating that customer to engage? What's the upside of that versus the downside of not being successful, which would have different tentacles? One could be the exposure of fraud, or one could be possibly the customer only activates it at a time of desperation, which is not always a bad thing because it's also a moment of truth. But really being able to sort of figure out the science behind what are the different elements of how the math of that relationship works in a mutually viable way, and how does that then create different branches through which you think about, hey, we really want to sort of shut this down, or maybe we want to be able to approach this particular customer differently. I think it does actually go back to what Carolee was saying earlier about having a surgical segmented view based on the data that you have on the customer, including the customer experience and the touch points, but also based on the data that you have that helps you understand the 360 view of that customer. What is the context in which that particular customer is operating in their relationship with different financial institutions? What is their 360 value independent of their relationship with you? What is that share that you think you might have a chance at? And what is that value at stake? And how does that drive whether you choose to close it or different avenues?
Yeah, I would just highlight, I don't think closure is the only option in terms of responses here to an account you've identified as being dormant and risky, right? Again, not every dormant account is a risky account, but as you are able to segment and understand which dormant accounts pose risk, you do want to do something about that. You can think about just, additional step-up measures the next time somebody logs in, trying to make those both safe and as seamless as possible from a CX perspective. You can think about account kind of holds and freezes rather than account closures. That often then doesn't bring in things like, refunds or the same level of customer support. You want to kind of, again, be segmented and then approach, I think, with appropriate treatment strategies depending on the risk that you're trying to mitigate. And I would say broad-based just going towards closure wouldn't be the like my personal first take. Of course, there's going to be cases where you're seeing something that's particularly high risk and you do need to close it for whatever reason. But there's a lot of things you can do before you get to that point, as long as you're thinking about it proactively and then appropriately routing your treatment strategies to the risk in question.
Yeah, and I think that ties into customer engagement as well, because there is an art to how you're engaging with the customer. Now, there's different elements to that, right? The contact information could be outdated for a number of reasons, right? They moved, they changed their address, they changed their phone number. Let's say the customer comes back and wants to reactivate that account, right? Obviously, there should be measures in place, just like a reactivation, but sometimes there's a little bit extra measures in place because they have stepped away for so long. That creates a user experience that could be unfavorable as well, right? So at that point, you only have a few minutes, or the customer only has a few minutes to say, this is too much. I'd prefer not to use this account. And that creates a challenge, right? What happens with that account now? Does it remain a dormant account, or does it get closed out? Apparently, I agree with you. I think there are different measures we can take. It doesn't have to be a closed account. At that point, there could be an increased level of engagement for the customer, or to the customer to notify them, hey, you have a closed account or a dormant account, unused account. And sometimes there's even fees that are still being incurred, right? So it is to their benefit to know that their account is collecting fees while it is an open account. So it's a fine balance. It really is.
Yeah, from a customer standpoint. There's sorry to interrupt, Nick, but there's no better moment than when a financial institution comes to me and says, hey, did you know we're charging you for this and we shouldn't be? Right. And I just, oh boy, my level of loyalty just went up a notch, right? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. And it can cut across risk, right? One of the really important prerequisites here is to understand the risk of that account, and all the way from the account creation and the identity through the life cycle of the account. There are also other, there are compliance related topics that come in here. There are state regulations. There are consumer protection expectations that are increasingly ratcheting up across the industry. And so to be able to have a strategy or a set of strategies around this that's thought through and vetted with your compliance groups, with your fraud risk groups, with your customer experience or operations groups is really important to be methodical about how you go about this, so that you do have to Paraly's where Paraly started. You have more options than just, do I shut it or do I open it?
One just underlying theme, I think, of a lot of what we've been saying is that for a long time, I think how folks thought about mitigating fraud risk was proof of work, right? Add friction, the fraudsters will go to a place that is less friction filled, and your good customers will make it through. Like, that was sort of a long time underlying hypothesis for fraud mitigation that I think we've seen in today's world is just fundamentally flawed. Like, that is no longer right. Actually, it is the fraudsters who are most likely to put the work in because they have, set something up for themselves. They see the value at the end, and they're about to make an outsized, return on that work. And so, like, just the broad brushstrokes of give everybody friction, make it kind of painful, then the fraudsters will opt out and go somewhere easier. There are now too many fraudsters. They are, it's no longer kind of like slowest gazelle out there. Like, every gazelle is under attack by the lions all the time. Yeah, you can add in all of the automation, right? And so, I think a lot of, I'm putting words in everyone's mouth here, but I think what a lot of us are saying and would stand by is we've gone from just add friction to be highly strategic, very direct, and very kind of conscious of putting measures in place that mitigate the specific risk that you are seeing, not just a broad-based like add friction and everything will be fine. I think that's been a key shift in what we all need to do and think about every day over the last few years. And I would imagine is what a lot of us spend every day thinking about. How do you do that very carefully and in a very targeted way?
I am definitely the slowest gazelle.
Go ahead. Oh, sorry. The notes I've taken for myself, Paraly, based on what you said, is think about risk, credit risk, think about fraud risk, quantify revenue upside, and have a perspective on customer level ops costs, and recognize the power of selection bias or adverse selection that could guide how you'd want to tackle this challenge / opportunity, because all of those have come into play.
Could not agree more.
Murli, I want to circle back to a comment that you made earlier that I thought was pretty interesting, because I couldn't quite understand how you must wrestle with this question. You mentioned the serving the customers in their times of need, and that the activation in that moment can be a moment of truth.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really challenging problem, much more than just that one little phrase captures. Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Yes. So my point there was we could actually access multi-years of history of how that particular customer or consumer has behaved in their entire financial services context. And then maybe some particular circumstance at this point is leading them to say, gee whiz, I don't want to have this, say, a credit card, to use a credit product as an example, that's been sitting in my dresser for the last year. Now I want to activate it because I have a particular need to have more access to credit. That's sort of a signal, to the extent that you've actually normalized for any fraud risks and such. You've got that customer history and you know how stable they've been in their demand for credit and how they've responsibly behaved. And you have that opportunity there to say, it isn't just about the fact that now they're wanting you and therefore you don't want them, i.e. you don't want to be in a situation where you say, I only want the customers who don't want me, and I don't want the customers who want me. That just feels like it's a very narrow view of thinking about it. But my point was, you have that opportunity there to rebuild, reinvigorate, and reposition how you relate to that customer, not only at that point, but going forward, how that relationship matters to them. And so in a very narrow sense, it's easy to say, I don't want customers who want me, but that would be an utterly myopic way of thinking about it. And you can, on the flip side, think of it as an opportunity to say, in this moment, I have a chance to build this relationship that can last me for the next decade or so.
Really, just to build on that, one of the key threats that we see very commonly of late is scams. And these dormant accounts can be one component or one tool in the fraudster's toolbox in scamming somebody. And in those cases, in many cases, the customer is the weak link, right? They're the ones who are being scammed. And so you can do a lot of verification around them. They will continue to, they will pass the one-time password. They will give you whatever information you want. They feel conviction that this is what they want to do. Moving upstream of that and thinking about your customer education strategy and how you, number one, understand who your more vulnerable customer populations or segments are, and then what you do to secure those accounts or work with them to secure those accounts and educate them about some of the things that are coming. In some cases, it can give you the opportunity to have a very positive moment of truth with them, where you're proactively reaching out, as Bo said, reaching out maybe not to say, we've been charging you and we shouldn't, but maybe we're reaching out to say, we have more protections we can put on, and educate them on what you're trading there. We're going to ask you to do this in the future because we're trying to protect you, or we're asking you for this piece of information now so that we can use it later to make sure that we don't have any negative outcomes.
The interesting thing about what you just said, Nick, is we, I think as an industry, do a pretty reasonably good job of individual transactions. However, I'm not sure that we've taken that same concept of individual transactions and sort of aggregated that and said, could we actually get a sense of which customers are more susceptible based on maybe not necessarily their demographics, although that could be one piece of it, but based on where they swipe their cards, how often they swipe their cards, and things of that nature, and sort of really use advanced AI for anomaly detection at a customer level, not just an individual transaction level. Right. Then you're actually sort of thinking about what is that likelihood, and you're now providing an added service that creates goodwill all around. I hadn't frankly thought about that concept before, but as you sort of mentioned what you just said, as you've articulated what you just did, it helps me recognize that that's probably an opportunity for this industry to serve the broader customer base.
I would strongly agree with that, but also advocate that kind of original identity data is also a very key component of that broad understanding, as are kind of other event types. So we think about, for example, like account updates. Those are a key trigger moment that are a non-financial, non-monetary transaction, right? It's not part of your transaction history, but it can tell you something about the riskiness of an account in an account takeover situation. Updating contact information is often one of the first things that fraudsters do, but it's also something we do every time we move, right? So how do you, kind of screen for that risk in a thoughtful way? Similarly, linking a new account to your account, right? So, suddenly there's a new account with all the data that comes with, that the existence of that account being used, whether it's to pay a credit card or to fund a bank account. Every time there's a new linking moment, that gives you additional signal. And then there's, login data, device data, biometric and behavioral data. Do you click on stuff? Do you ever log in? And what do you do when you do? There's the wealth of data to truly build an understanding of identity and then to detect divergence in that over time. I think we barely scratched the surface, but there's so much to do there. And I do think that's how, a key component to how we beat the fraudsters.
100%. It's not just the transactions, it's the interactions as well. And it's the ability to stitch them and take a longitudinal view and to be able to apply advanced analytics to detect the phrase that we use as hotspots, bright red spots, where, again, it may not even be a 50% or even a 20% probability, because your baseline likelihood of a fraud transaction might be 0.2%, but if you 20 times that baseline, that is a legitimate hotspot. Being able to be thread that needle by connecting both the interactions and the transactions is where the power is, and including interactions is you logged onto your mobile, you press this, or you hung on to this particular screen for a while, or what have you. It's essentially every nugget of eyeballs or any text and such that reflect the totality of your relationship with that institution. There's a lot of magic in there, and I don't know from an industry perspective how well we've been able to connect both of those and solve this problem at that next level, perhaps.
Since we have a couple of representatives from very large institutions, among the largest financial institutions in the world, I wanted to address one question that was added by one of our participants when they signed up to view the webinar, which is, are there any best practices for banks specifically that that you would highlight that might be different from your other from other institutions?
One thing that I'll start with is that recognizing the bigger the bank, the bigger the regulation, the higher the expectations. There are a number of consumer protection topics in this space. So when I think about, for example, using a stored value card for maybe unemployment benefits or for other benefits like we saw during the pandemic, priority number one obviously needs to make sure that we are in compliance. Priority number two probably is that we're doing right by the customer and that we're making sure that if a consumer needs access to their funds for a legitimate purpose, and they are who they say they are, that we're granting that access. That can be really, really difficult in these types of situations where you have maybe a dormant account, very little information to go off of. And maybe their behavior is changing. Maybe they, have lost their job or something like the pandemic has happened. And so history doesn't necessarily reflect what we're seeing now. And you really have to be able to dig in on those and understand what's going on before you can do something like giving them a much higher credit limit. Are they going out to buy a new roof for the house because they had a weather event, or are they going out to, have a bust out fraud in that account?
Yeah, and I think there's definitely I think apparently you've been talking about this for some time as well. There's context to be added, right? There's things that we should be looking at, right? Some introductions like geolocation, right? That's a big one. If the person is logging in from a complete different location, doesn't necessarily mean it's fraud. To everybody's point, they could have moved, but you could never just base it off of that alone, right? There should be a combination of other user behavior, login attempts, maybe changes in transaction amounts as well, right? That suddenly changed. All of that, it fed into machine learning or AI to produce this predictive modeling around potential fraudulent behavior is, I think, a necessary step, right? Because at some point, there's only so much we can front load on the customer to validate through multi-factor authentication. The fraudsters are thinking smarter, right? They're using AI to create new fraud methods. So we should be using AI as well. Our banking institutions should be using AI as well to create modeling around different types of behavior. Because as humans, that's what we do. We are, some of us are creatures of habit, but there are instances that do require us to change our behavior.
And some of that, this is a fintech group to some extent. Some of those things can be addressed by partnership and conversations among the institutions. So when you think about on-ramps, off-ramps, the role banks play in things like crypto and then the role that something like that may play in moving funds out of the financial system or across geographies, there's some good conversations to be had between different types of institutions about, how are we letting things wire together? What are the controls that we're putting in place? What reliances or information sharing could we have with each other that is permissible and advantageous on both sides? I think there's probably a lot more that the industry could do in that space that could help in some of these, especially where you think about on-ramps, off-ramps, and the fact that those can be very large dollar value events in some cases.
We probably do a pretty good job of third-party fraud. For me, it is being able to detect third-party fraud through a much more connected set of data elements is where there's probably more room for opportunity, I would suspect. And then the other thing that I would think of is there's probably firms such industries such as healthcare and consumer tech and such that grapple with a parallel issue. It may not exactly be fraud as we might define it within financial services, but some element of that. And they have as much interaction and transaction data as we would. So there's, without full disclosure, I don't spend a meaningful amount of my time thinking about this particular topic, but I'd imagine there's parallels that we could learn. And I guess the other thing that it might sort of be, might provide some food for thought is at the end of the day, what you were alluding to, Nick, and you, Juan, as well, is you're toggling customer experience with mitigating fraud. And there are always false positives and false negatives. And how do you value that equation of false positive and false negatives? And how does that sort of guide you? And how does that in a more dynamic way affect the behavior of potential fraudsters? Is probably that next level sophistication that we could bring as a firm, as an industry, excuse me.
There are also some experience and design and strategy choices that institutions on all sides of the ecosystem can make. You know, when you think about the market pressures to have shameless plug, Visa is a very safe way to pay. But there are other ways, you know, and increasingly there's a diversity of ways that people may want to pay for certain things. And to your point, it may be different by industry. You know, in paying my rent, I may have one preference. In paying for coffee, I may have a different preference. And in paying for groceries, I may have yet another preference. And so looking at how you can have equivalent protection for the consumer and equivalent risk mitigation for the institution across those different ways that payments happen is really important. And I think it's, again, because it's a newer area and an area of a lot of innovation right now, there's a lot of unanswered questions about how you can secure real-time payments, for example, or other ways that consumers are really strongly demanding that they be able to transact.
And just another, oh, go ahead.
Go for it.
I was just going to say another kind of an interesting stat. SIFT just released its Q3 2022 Digital Trust and Safety Index, and I was looking at some of the stats in there, and you know, we are all a little bit caught between a rock and a hard place too. Something that jumped out to me was more than half of victims of ATO did not discover that their accounts had been compromised until at some point in the future they logged in and like noticed that something weird was happening. So it was the consumer who noticed, not the institution. Then, you know, I think 43% of consumers stated they would no longer use any product that was ever compromised in ATO. And at the same time, we all know that you lose customers very quickly when you add friction to the process, or if you over notify them or scare them about things that are actually their behavior. So there is this, you know, kind of very profound push towards accuracy and how can you detect it? But also, you know, if you don't detect it, if you don't react, there's real costs to that. If you know, do detect it and you do react, but it's a false positive, there's costs to that. You know, there's going to be kind of real customer impact no matter kind of what direction you take it. And so, you know, I think, Marley, at different points, you've talked about kind of like this core equation, right? And I think that for every institution, bank, fintech, you know, really understanding where you want to fall on that equation and kind of what costs you're willing to bear, what costs you're not, how that aligns with your brand and your message and the customer experience you're targeting creating. And then how do you use the absolute best tools in the business all together to form as complete a picture as possible so that you can ultimately, you know, try to bring those false positive and false negative rates down over time instead of seeing them escalate.
Apparently, I think consumer awareness has an evil nemesis, and it's consumer fatigue, right? Mm-hmm. I've gotten those emails, and it usually is an email, right? Unusual account login activity notice. Sometimes I react to it, and I'll be honest, sometimes I don't. But I think that it's usually an
and we also get those emails now from the fraudsters, right? I would say like half of those emails are phishing attacks that I get now.
They're very good emails. Sometimes, you know, they're branded. There's the phishing activity around is just so good. But my point is, to your point, right? It's a very lucrative thing to target a dormant account because, as you said, ATO attacks go unnoticed, right? And they can go unnoticed. So it almost becomes a perfect storm when it's a dormant account, right? And the fraudsters just targeting this account. There's a very real chance that the owner of the account may never know that this is happening. So at that point, it almost shifts the onus of responsibility on the organization to look at that type of behavior, right? Because this is just going and ongoing. Consumer's not going to do anything about it. So yeah, the weight actually does move on the organization's part. But yeah, consumer fatigue is a very real thing, and that just plays into consumer awareness.
It's a really vexing challenge. I'm stunned at how vast this surface area is for innovation and problem solving. It has to be the most among the most interesting frontiers that we're exploring right now as a financial services in the financial services world. This analogy may be lost on 98% of you, but there is no Benedict option here. We cannot go just rip ourselves out of society, bring everything into a cash format and live with cash. Those days are gone.
Yeah.
So it is.
We weren't less vulnerable, right? Like it's not like that actually would leave you well protected and secure either at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. So what let's talk about the frontiers then. Like what are the things that are captivating your creative energy right now in the sense that like you've got this play space. What's really engaging you right now and getting you excited, whether or not it's something you're working on today or not?
I'll jump in with the thought is, for me, it is, we've talked a lot about customer experience in the context of fraud and dormant accounts. For me, it's having the opportunity to bring the science to be able to put financial metrics to individual touch points, whether they're positive or whether they're adverse, and understand the future revenue implications of that, and being able to sort of bring that back and then say, how do we make very deliberate, highly surgical choices to increase customer experience in a way that is quantifiable, so that you not only just focus on a soft but important metric such as Net Promoter Score, rather you're able to say, if I want to spend these $10 million in either marketing or on customer experience, where would I spend it? You know, we've cracked the science around on the marketing side, which segment, what product, what offer, which channel, and so on and so forth. And on the other end, you want to be able to toggle it to say, well, you know, which specific customer experience touch points, is it a surprise and delight, or is it sort of mitigating the downside? Being able to bring that science, because if you sort of abstract from that, our objective as any enterprise, whether it's banking or not, is to build sustainable, mutually economically beneficial relationships with our customers. Why is it then in that world do we think about customer experience in much more esoteric terms, and we think about marketing in more concrete terms? How do we bring that that economic decisioning to the same surface area so that you're toggling those dollars with much greater granular intelligence in service of that mission of building a sustainable, mutually viable relationship with your customers? That's one of 20 things that take my time.
I love it. And at the risk of throwing a monkey wrench into it, I think one of the things that we're really focusing hard on is privacy in this space, because there are a lot of solutions out there. There are a lot of really great technologies that can solve some of these problems. Increasingly, as Visa, our customers across merchants and financial institutions are asking us to down select to just the techniques and tools and capabilities that will be future-proof and that will preserve privacy of the consumer. And as we see things in California, we see things in Europe, or we just see things that maybe Apple and Google are rolling out. We see things in specific countries around privacy, and we've got to make sure that what we're doing has the level of security we need and has the level of ability to connect to history and profile and a lot of the techniques we've talked about here, but also doesn't necessarily expose the consumer's behavior, their identity, their information, which can create other risks, including insider risks, including compliance risks, or legal risks.
I mean, look, I'll say a couple of things, Nick. I struggle personally in a world of, where generative AI is is a hot new topic. How do we think about future proof? I don't know. I've just given up on that because for me that's a little bit of an illusion. I mean, a year ago I was aware of large language models, and my team used it for one of the more interesting problems we were solving. But the concept of generative AI did not enter my parlance, full disclosure, till we turned the page into 2023. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that I think is a real struggle from a broader societal level is preserving privacy. It's really tough because we're all willing to give up privacy because we want free. We probably all have Gmails and things like that, and those are free. And in their interest, many of these firms probably don't offer a fee-based product that collects zero data because that's not as valuable. So I think that there are some real gnarly issues that not just in financial services, but in society, we've got to grapple with, because my conclusion in some of this is we all want our cakes and eat them too. And how do we sort of match our desires with sort of what trade-offs we're actually willing to make as individuals or as society is tough. Not to get overly philosophical, so I'll pause.
Bo asked about the play space that we were working in.
Yeah, totally. It's a big space. So go ahead and be philosophical. Paralee, what's taking your creative energy?
Yeah, so I'm actually really focused on that future-proofing concept that you all are mentioning and raising. And to me, the core of future-proofing is how do you get your data in one place? And then how do you make it really, really easy to make and test changes? Because I think the only thing that we can absolutely know is that the fraud vectors of today won't be the fraud vectors of tomorrow. And so we can say with, pretty close to 100% confidence that the fraudsters are innovating and will continue to innovate. And that if you block off one particular vector of attack, a new vector will emerge. And, again, it's not enough to just not be the slowest gazelle anymore. Like, we're surrounded and we need to make sure that we have a robust response and that we're constantly evolving that response. So that's a lot of like what I focus on every day at Alloy is how do we help make sure that our clients are able to get all of their data in one place, and how do we give them a really robust tool set to try things, to test it out, to test it, to back test it, to champion challenger test it, to shadow test it, to, test it on sample personas, to bring, awareness that, new fraud vector A has emerged in a subset of our clients. How do we make sure that everybody is thinking about the best response to that even before it hits them? That's not in any way future-proofing the solution. It's not saying that the way we solve this today is going to be the way that we solve it tomorrow, but I have a lot of conviction that the way we solve it today and tomorrow is going to be best rooted with a unified look at data and with a focus on flexible changes to what you actually do, how you actually respond going forward. And so that's a lot of what I spend my days as a product leader thinking about and building with our team, because I can't imagine that won't be absolutely critical and necessary, regardless of what the actual response at any particular moment to any hot vector might be.
So you're future-proofing by practice, by behavior, by process. right?
Yeah, I mean, if I look at kind of my background as a product leader at Fintechs, I just remember of like, very constructively, but like always butting heads with the head of risk who had like 15 more things to add to my backlog, and then having to build those, and then weighing that against a growth driving measure, right? I can either go get more customers, or I can cut off this risk vector, and resources are always finite. As much as you can make kind of that ability to experiment and innovate something that is not developer intensive, something that is happening entirely within UIs controlled by teams, where data scientists can pull and play with the data and create models and load those models and run those models. Like, the more you can give folks flexible infrastructure, the less companies have to make that trade-off between growth and risk. Ideally, there'll always be some happy tension, but we want to let more good customers in, and then at the same time have rich tool sets to help all the folks that are thinking through new innovation be able to try them, and not just have to theorize about them.
All right, Juan, you get the last word. Tell us what is taking your creative energy, and why.
I think the term future proofing is being thrown around. I don't disagree, but I would personalize it. I think my initiative, my goal is to future proof myself, because technology is advancing so quickly. Let's be honest. We talked about generative AI. You're absolutely right. I mean, I knew about large language models, the data lake risks, from a few years back, but generative AI was new to me as well. So I started exploring that as well. But if we have this conversation tomorrow in a few months, I'm sure the conversation is going to be that much different, right? Because fraudsters are going to have that much more of a lead time with advancement in technology. So from my end, it's understanding what works today, right? What are some of the basics that still work? We know 2FA, just standard 2FA is no longer good enough, right? So at what point do we introduce multi-factor? And then we start digging into what types of multi-factor are working, how much is too much, right? There's also, this is a rabbit hole we could go down for about 2 hours, right? Because now we talk about expenses around that. It gets pretty expensive from a business standpoint to introduce too much, but then you also sacrifice user experience. So I think what keeps me up and what I'm constantly striving towards is understanding what works today versus what we need to start anticipating for the future. And it really does come down to AI. I think AI is really going to continue to play a very important role in how we protect user engagement. From an onboarding standpoint, look, we started with dormant account, right? We talked about dormant accounts, and we quickly learned that dormant accounts is just one symptom of account takeovers, right? It's a very prevalent, it's a dangerous one, but it is still inherently an account takeover. And an account takeover happens in many ways, right? Especially with data breaches happening daily. My information is for sale out there. Your information, unfortunately, is for sale out there. The fraudsters know this, and there's ways to reverse engineer that information, right? And all they need is maybe a phone number, maybe a first name, a last name to start creating a profile around you. And with the introduction of AI, you can fast track that so much quicker. So my initiative, my goal, my passion right now is understanding what we can do to hopefully stay on top of this, right? Maybe put ourselves one step ahead of fraudsters, and continue that trend down the road.
That's great. That's great. Well, we clearly all have our hands full, and as evidenced by the energy and creativity that was brought forth in this conversation, I think we have a lot more to talk about in the future as well. And look, I think we're all on the same team. It feels like we're all paddling in the same direction. There is a real need and response from fraud fighters everywhere to sort of join forces and do battle for the good of our customers, because our customers are our moms and dads and aunts and uncles and kids and cousins and friends and neighbors and everybody else. And we really do want to live in a society that has characteristics of free and safe commerce. So it's a fundamental need. So thank you. Like, seriously, like, hats off to you for putting in all this hard work and making our lives better. Thanks especially to Juan and Telesign for making this happen. It's tremendous to work with you and bringing together this talent like we have today is fantastic. So a great service to our community. Thanks again. And thank you, panelists, for joining and sharing and keeping me out of the discussion. You did a great job of just having a really rich discussion between yourselves. So thanks very much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks all.
This has been great. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Take care, everybody.
We just drop off. Just
Yep,
leave?
we're good.
Well, this is great. This is fun.
Thanks, Juan. Take care.